Thanks to CuriosityStream for supporting PBS Digital Studios. Did you know it used to be illegal to be ugly and that these laws helped lead to freak shows? From the 1860s and into the 20th century, many cities across the US had so-called ugly laws, and if you're accused of violating them, then you could, in fact, be arrested for ugliness. But these codes weren't intended to judge people based on attractiveness like a 19th century Tinder, but actually a method of legal discrimination designed to keep people who were differently abled, injured, destitute, or any combination of these categories off of the streets and out of sight. And although we think we've come a long way, the last case involving an ugly law was in 1974, only 16 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law. Yikes. So, how did this all arise? Well, our first question needs to be, what are ugly laws and when were they first passed? In her book, The Ugly Laws, Disability in Public, Susan Schweik traces the earliest history of these laws in the US to 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War. In San Francisco, a former Union soldier named Martin Oates was arrested and then written about in the San Francisco Morning Call, which reported him as a half-demented fellow named Martin Oates who had been stricken down with paralysis, leaving him a perfect wreck. Schweik then notes that Oates was arrested and taken into custody while San Francisco awaited the completion of its almshouse, or a place designed to charitably take in the poor and destitute. The law that was used to arrest Oates had been passed a few weeks earlier and called for people who were diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed to be removed from the streets or to be otherwise kept from public view and prohibited from begging. But if you're not allowed to be seen outside, then how can you get a job? And if you can't get a job, then how could you survive? This was essentially the equivalent of a legal catch-22. So that brings us to our second question. Was there any way around this employment discrimination? One of the weird loopholes of the Ugly Law's employment restrictions was that a person could get around them if they had a disability and were also shown in public as part of a demonstration. In her article Disability and the Circus, Professor Rachel Adams notes that while ugly laws prevented people with signs of visible difference from being seen in public, which limited the kinds of jobs they could hold, sideshows were often ways for people to make money to survive in the absence of a well-sustained and corruption-free social safety net. But these shows were frequently dehumanizing for performers, and not every performer was treated well or fairly compensated in the 19th century or early 20th century. So we have a basic rundown on when these laws started to spring up and how they affected people, but our next question is, why were they getting passed? Although the law made its first appearances in the US in 1867, Schweik traces these instances all over the country, and each one seems to have language that is worse than the last. And between 1880 and the 19-teens, cities and states across the country passed similar laws, including Chicago, Portland, Denver, Lincoln, Omaha, Reno, Columbus, Ohio, and the state of Pennsylvania. And New York and Los Angeles both attempted to pass ugly laws, even though they were ultimately unsuccessful. The period when we see the spike in ugly laws and anti-beggary laws overlaps closely with the period in US history known as the Progressive Era, which spanned from around 1890 through the 1920s. And ugly laws arise as a result of local governments trying to force people into newly constructed almshouses and sanitariums. The Progressive Era was marked by a push for greater social reform and anti-corruption laws to combat the downsides of the Industrial Revolution, including poor health, urban poverty, and rapid overpopulation in big cities. Sounds almost too good to be true, right? Well, that's because in a lot of ways it was. Even though many progressives wanted to fight government corruption, many of the almshouses and sanitariums that sprung up around this time were also rife with corruption of their own, and lots of ugly laws sprung up as an excuse to arrest people and then move them into almshouses, or to bar those who wouldn't or couldn't go to almshouses and sanitariums from going outside. And although enactment of these laws appears to have waned around World War I, the last time an ugly law was used as a reason to arrest someone came in 1974 in Omaha, Nebraska, when a police officer wanted to arrest a homeless man and found the old law was still on the books. Unsurprisingly, this didn't go down too well with the prosecutors, who declined to throw the metaphorical book at someone for an outdated law. But after decades of political pressure and organization by disability rights activists, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 was signed into law by former President George H.W. Bush. Modeled after other laws that sought to guarantee the right to public space and access to equal opportunity to all citizens, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the ADA's purpose is to ensure that citizens with disabilities can have equal employment opportunities, fair access to government services and programs, and that public spaces provide them with reasonable accommodations. And even after the ADA was passed in 1990, there's still valuable work being done by disability rights activists today to guarantee that all Americans continue to have increased access to civil rights and all forms of public space. So how does it all add up? Well, although the ugly laws have a colloquial name that makes them sound more like fiction than fact to modern viewers, they existed not so long ago and were designed as a form of discrimination against a pretty wide range of people in the late 19th and early 20th century. And although new ugly laws stopped getting written around World War I and were rarely enforced after that point, they remained on the books in US cities like Omaha and Chicago until 1974, before they were officially repealed. So while this may seem like very far back history, it's actually more recent than you'd think. So, ugly laws. Kind of funny name, not so funny history. So, what do you think? Anything to add on why these relatively widespread laws aren't well known today? Let me know down in the comments. Be sure to follow Origin of Everything on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, and we'll see you next week. Thank you to CuriosityStream for supporting PBS Digital Studios. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers documentaries and nonfiction titles from a variety of filmmakers, including CuriosityStream originals. For instance, CuriosityStream has Viruses, Destruction and Creation, a short documentary on the science behind viruses and how they spread. You can learn more at curiositystream.com/origin and use the code ORIGIN during the sign-up process. Hey guys, thanks for all of your comments and questions on our episode on Jesus' name being a transliteration of Joshua. Here's what a few of you had to say. David Shee on YouTube pointed out that Henry Liddell, the classic scholar from the 19th century whose work I cited last week, was also the father of Alice Liddell. Alice is probably most famously known as the namesake of Lewis Carroll's children's book, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Thanks for the fun fact, David. Lizette Pasajando on Facebook pointed out that while she never thought that Christ was Jesus' last name, she did used to think that it was his middle name when she was a child. That's pretty funny since when I was younger, I only heard people say Jesus H. Christ when they were annoyed, and assumed that his middle name was H. Thanks for watching and for sharing in the middle name debate, Lizette. Hoop Gene on YouTube has another fan pick for an episode on why the creation of peanut butter is maybe falsely attributed to George Washington Carver. This is also a good topic since I love peanut butter and researching stuff, and this may give me the chance to unite my two greatest loves. Thanks Hoop Gene, aka Hoop Gene it is, just throwing out a new username suggestion for you. So that's it for now, and we'll see you next week.